Gasha Anmen Shagamuta Uzalamude. Gashan Anamen Shagamuta Uzalamude. Uzalamude Ene di Amude. Uzala Gidiache Endu Dugamude. Gabamu Unri. Unkuliana Gabamu Unri. Une Shunia Shu Shamu Undu. Dingirushum Galana. Gu Ma'a. Gudaba Anla. Now these 7 lines translated into English are as follows. Last night, as I the Queen was shining bright, last night, as I the Queen of Heaven was shining bright, as I was shining bright, as I was dancing about, as I was uttering a song at the brightening of the oncoming night, he met me. The Lord Kuliana met me. The Lord put his hand into my hand. Dumuzi embraced me.
We have with us today Samuel Noah Kramer, Clark Research Professor Emeritus of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania and Curator Emeritus of the Babylonian section of the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. For many years, Professor Kramer has written on Sumerian civilization. He's the author of more than 25 books and monographs, more than 150 articles on Sumerian civilization, and his most recent book is History Begins at Sumer. Professor Kramer, I'd like to welcome you to the Rockport Writers Forum series. I'm interested, you were reading something which you consider literature, I think. What is Sumerian literature? What do you mean by it?
Sumerian literature consists, we now know, after many, many years of research by numerous scholars, including myself, we know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments, and so-called wisdom literature, which consists of proverbs, fables, and essays of various sorts, especially essays in relation to education. That tells us something about the old education. We know now, after many, many years, that there are about 20 myths. Mm-hmm. Many of them have been translated in part, but the situation is still in flux. Things are still myths are still being translated. We have 9 epic tales, so that we can now speak of a Sumerian heroic age of about 2500 or even earlier BC. That would include, of course, the famous hero Gilgamesh, but not only Gilgamesh, that has been known for many, many years, but also his predecessors, such as Enmerkar and Lugalbanda, who preceded Gilgamesh, and about whom we have several heroic tales, several epic tales. It includes, in addition to epics and myths, and those are the 2 aspects of the Sumerian literary genre that I particularly specialized on. Mm-hmm. And also one other genre that I specialized on, which maybe while the others are very happy, joyous things, the others are lamentations, like lamentation over the destruction of Sumer, lamentation over the destruction of Ur, lamentation over the destruction of Nippur, which gives, in which the poet gives his idea of how and why these cities and Sumer were destroyed, and depict some of the agonies and the wretchedness and the misery of these conquests. Certainly matters quite unknown until these lamentations came into vogue. So we have a good many lamentations, a great many hymns, hundreds of them. I have not particularly concentrated on hymns. I have translated several, but other scholars have done and are doing a good deal of work, so that at present we could have translations of, let's say, 20 or so hymns, but there are still hundreds to be translated of these hymns.
I see.
And then there are the famous wisdom texts, some of which have been translated, but a good many of which are still in the process of being reconstructed and put together and translated. And the man that will do that, I hope, and I hope he hears this, is Professor Miguel Civil, who is a professor at the University of, at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and who was my assistant and associate for some years at the University of Pennsylvania, who is one of the leading of the new generation, one of the leading cuneiformists and especially Sumerologists of, you might say, of the younger generation. And he has been working on them for quite a number of years, and there's every hope that in the relatively near future he will produce those.
Good.
And the reason, John, they are so important, I've always... I've had some difficulties with Mr. Civil on that account, because I've urged them all the time, again and again, please produce translations of these. The reason being that they, if you analyze their contents, if you analyze the contents of these disputations, for instance, one man disputes with another and tells him why he is an incapable person, why he himself is a great person, and in the process of doing it, they tell you more about the daily life, the actual daily life that's going on in Sumer, than all the myths and all the epics and all the lamentations, which are, after all, conventional forms that only very indirectly tell you about the daily life of the ordinary Sumerian. But these disputations and these essays tell you a great deal. However, we must exonerate Mr. Civil a little bit. They are very difficult to translate.
They're difficult for what reason? What makes them difficult?
Because they tend to be laconic. They tend to introduce new Sumerian words and phrases that are not known. They introduce them in a context that's not as readily controllable as we can control in epics and myths, especially in myths, for example, and laments. You get the general drift just from the content of thing. When I talk about a lamentation, I know that the next thing is going to be something lamentful and tend to be able to look for it. But when it comes to these disputations and proverbs, they are usually laconically written. And if you choose a wrong meaning, let me say, for certain passages, you get an entirely wrong picture of what is supposed to be. You sometimes get a negative for a positive, for example, which of course so that it's a very difficult task, and he's a very careful scholar, and therefore it takes a long time. Nevertheless, we do hope that he will put those out. And again, I stress these because they are the only way we have of getting the ordinary daily psychological life attitudes of the various people. Whereas in the case of the myths, we only get the attitudes of the poets, the people that have almost, you might say, an axe to grind, favoring a certain deity, favoring a certain king, and fantasizing with their imagination about the heroic deeds of this and that man, so that we don't get a real historical picture. As you well know, the Gilgamesh epic has been well known, but we still don't get a real idea of what did Gilgamesh actually do in the city of Erech when he became king.
Now, do we know the time period of Sumerian literature? And
yes, we do. And that's an interesting phenomenon, too. When I began to study of Sumerian literature, in my first book, Sumerian Mythology, I used to date the tablets on which these were written about 2000 BC. We now know that they're a bit later. They're about 1800 BC. We know that. Now we know, however, that these tablets, many of them, that is the hymns, the myths, the epics inscribed on these tablets, were not originally composed in 1800. That we are sure of. Mm-hmm. They were originally composed considerably earlier. That would be around 2 or 3 centuries earlier. So that in my next revision, in my second revision of Sumerian mythology, for example, I corrected the dates, and I said there is very good hope that sometime, very reasonable hope, that we will find the originals from which these copies were made sometimes around 2100 BC. Mm-hmm. And that would be in a period, and I will perhaps be a little technical, that is generally known in the textbooks and among scholars as the third dynasty of Ur. That was a famous dynasty when Sumerian had a kind of renaissance. So our feeling was that the that the epics and myths and hymns that we were translating came from copies that were actually first originated, or that the original composer, the original writer of which lived around 2100 BC during this Renaissance.
For you.
Okay.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
You're reading these. You started out reading this difficult cuneiform.
Right.
How do you know that that's what it sounds?
Well, let me just give you three more lines. The beginning of a famous myth called, that I loved best, the myth Ananas descended and it begins Angalta Kigalshe Gestugani Nango, which means from the grade above to the grade below she set her mind, right?
Right.
So whenever I give a lecture, somebody from the audience gets up and says, Dr. Kramer, are you pronouncing these? How do you know how to pronounce these words? And my answer then is as follows. If one of the dead Sumerians that Leonard Woolley dug up at Ur, if he was miraculously resurrected and came into the room and he heard me say, Angalta Kigalshe Gestuganinangu, he would say, that man Kramer, he's doing very well. He's pronouncing his words and I understand them. But my goodness, does he have a Jewish accent?
Thank you, Dr. Kramer.
Is that the, are we free now?
I think so.
Is he free?